And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nigel to tell you a little bit more about Puppet. Hopefully there'll be some stuff for, plenty of stuff for folks who are new to Puppet, as well as sort of where we're headed for folks who are already familiar with it.
So my name's Nigel Kersten. I've been at Puppet Labs a long time now, 4.5 years. And I ran Puppet for a long time before that at Google, so I feel like I've been doing Puppet longer than I've been at high school, which is a fair time. I'm CIO at Puppet Labs. I run internal IT, sysops, so all the people who run the Forge, the Puppet websites, and I run business operations as well. But I love coming and talking to people, and I particularly love coming to Berlin. Berlin's one of my favorite cities, and it's really awesome being here. I think Bern first organized OSDC, told me at PuppetConf last year in San Francisco, and was like, come to Berlin. And so we started planning the Puppet Camp then. So I need all of you to keep using Puppet, evangelizing Puppet, selling Puppet Enterprise, all these things, lots of reasons for me to come to Berlin. It's a very selfish reason. I'm Nigel Kersten on Twitter, and I'm just Nigel at Puppet Labs, if any of you want to email me. So we kind of, could you all please silence your mobile phones? That would be excellent. Unless you're on duty with a pager, in which case you can go sit up the back or something. So we like doing polls at Puppet Camps. We love trying to work out, exactly who's turning up each year. How many of you here identify as a developer rather than a sysadmin? If you're, okay. How many people are managers rather than actually doing anything? I hope you're all looking at your managers around here going, yeah. And how many of you are sysadmins, operations people? Excellent. That's pretty awesome. So who just started using Puppet in the last 3 months? It's okay, stick your hands up. We love new people at Puppet Camps. I think this is one of the really important things, and it's sort of become a little bit difficult as we grow and as the user base gets so big. There are people here in this room I know who've been using Puppet for 6 years, 7 years. So we're always trying to work out how do we make the content useful for everyone who's starting, as well as interesting to all those people who are really experienced with Puppet. And I think one of the things we love about our community is that it's really welcoming. If you know lots about Puppet, you end up helping out the new people. We have all these different avenues for that sort of thing. Who started using Puppet more than a year ago? This is going to be a good crowd. Who started using Puppet more than 5 years ago? Wow, I'm going to keep going. More than 6 years ago. That's pretty amazing. We have a whole bunch of people here. That's pretty cool. So this is a question I want to ask, mainly because I asked this at the OSDC talk I did as well, and I think it was really interesting to see the difference between the US and Europe here. How many of you are most of your infrastructure is in public cloud services? So just to make sure that you're all actually understanding my question, how many of you, most of your infrastructure is in servers you run in a data center or a colo? Or under your desk, that counts as well. That's pretty amazing. So I think this is a pretty cool thing, and it's really important for us to get outside of the US and sort of understand, how different things are. If you ask this at a Puppet Camp these days in the Bay Area, it would be 80–90% of people are running things in the public cloud, which I think is really interesting. Who's not using any automation at all yet? So I asked a few of you who's not using Puppet, any of the other tools in this space, and is here to try and work out, how do I do automation? Okay. So come and ask us questions. Come and talk to any of the Puppet Labs, any of the NETWAYS folks who are here. We're all really happy to talk about it. And ask questions of the rest of the community. This is really important for us. So being a sysadmin is difficult. I'm going to walk and go get my water. I'm not leaving the stage entirely. So I think a recent study came out basically sort of analyzing what's the day-to-day life of a sysadmin like. And on average, apparently we get interrupted every 15 minutes, which is kind of crap, Once you get interrupted, it takes like half an hour to get back into the flow of whatever you were doing. And I think this is one of the reasons why sysadmins gravitate towards automation so much, because it just stops you being interrupted. Or at least if you're being interrupted, it's a relatively short thing and the process you're running keeps going in its own. We're being asked to do more and more. I think we've been through sort of a landscape change in operations where people people are starting to understand that running IT and running operations actually sort of matters to the business. We're not, the trolls under the bridge in the dark room, that the business people like, I don't know what they do, they just cost us more and more money every year. And whenever I ask them to do anything, they say no. But I think this attitude's changing, and some of it's us. Some of us as sysadmins, we've got to learn to say yes more or ask more questions, not just give what people want, but actually deliver what they need. And so we really believe that, using a tool like Puppet sort of fundamentally changes what you do as a sysadmin. I know once I moved to a sort of much more of a fully automated deployment, the whole cadence of your work changes. You're not sort of always responding, to that urgent request that just happened half an hour ago. You get to sort of plan, and you get to treat things more like software development. Particularly in this crowd, we see whatever goes on with the public cloud, with people moving to platform as a service, with their launching their apps. There's no world we're coming to where there's going to be fewer servers. If you look at what happened, 10 years ago, if you asked an average non-technical person, how many servers do you interact with? There'd be, the file server at work and the mail server and, maybe the odd web page. But now, everyone's on their phones, all of those phones are consuming services that all require servers, whether they're in your data center, wherever they are. The average person is interacting with so many more servers than they were before. And I just really don't see this changing. But what we're going to have to do, we're not being given lots more resources to manage all of this stuff. We're all doing more and more all of the time. And so we've just got to work out, how do we provide that sort of reliable layer? We've got more complex services, the move to microservices. As someone at OSDC put it, it's like service-oriented architecture for startups. But people have moved to this space. No longer are these big monolithic applications that you hire a sysadmin who knows it really well and just keeps feeding that one application. We're being asked to kind of do repeatable work. And I think this is a really, really huge change. But the cool thing here is I think companies are recognizing this as well. And they don't just see us as cost centers anymore. They realize that if you're really good at operations and IT, that actually changes the business. And the business gets better and better at what it's actually doing. We need to get faster and more responsive at what we're doing. We're being more and more pressure. And I think a lot of this is due to, as consumers and users, the non-technical people in the rest of your company, they're using services online. They're used to just going to a web page, signing up for a service, maybe giving a credit card detail, and then they start using something. They're no longer installing big bits of complex software on their machines as often. They're just going to a website and signing up and using it. And then they come internally to the company and go, well, why isn't this how everything kind of works? I don't really understand. And I think user expectations have changed, which means that we need to get faster and faster. But I think the cool thing too about a lot of this change has been that people are used to smaller changes. They're no longer wanting these huge, big applications deployed for them. They're like, I just want to do this one thing. I'm used to signing up to a web service that just gives me a to-do list, like Wunderlist or AnyDo or anything like that. And they just want these small bits of functionality. So we've got to get better and better at creating small change, pushing it out really quickly, and then changing it and iterating upon it, which I think is good. We learned this from Agile, we learned this from Lean, that in software development, this is a better way to go. You're better off doing small course corrections all of the time, rather than heading off in one direction and then spending 3 months coming back to where you were. You're all cloud skeptics here, clearly. I would love to talk to more people about why they're not using cloud. I'm a little bit of a cloud skeptic, but I think there's sort of the best of both worlds. The talk I did at the NETWAYS OSDC conference was actually in defense of data centers. I'm a big believer in running your own infrastructure and owning it, and not just handing all control over to everyone. But I think there's a real spectrum here, and we can go in a whole bunch of different ways. And cloud's kind of a stupid term, companies have co-opted it and it gets marketed in all sorts of weird ways, but there is a thing there that I think is changing the landscape, and we're going to see more and more changes. How many of you run your own email servers? This is actually something I'm really interested in. How many people are using public cloud email, like Google, Microsoft, whoever? Okay. So I think there is a change kind of happening. I used to run a lot of email. I hate running email servers. I never want to touch another IMAP daemon in my life. But I congratulate you all, and hopefully things have got better since I stopped doing it. But we are seeing this shift. Certain kinds of things are just becoming commoditized. And if they're not something that's running in the cloud, they're at least sort of more appliance-like that we're seeing people go to. The cloud kind of lets a whole bunch of people move faster. And I think this is good for those of us who aren't even using the cloud. For sort of transparency, we use a lot of Amazon, Azure, Google at Puppet Labs, but we also run infrastructure. Like we have colos. We have our own network in between the colos. I like owning that stuff, and I think there's things that are good and things that are bad about both. But the cool thing I think about the public cloud is it's causing people to move quickly, and all sorts of cool development is happening with all of the tools we all use that we can take benefit of no matter where we run our workloads. How many of you are at least experimenting with containers in some form or another? Cool. How many people are actually running containers in production? How many are running in production not doing CI? So if you're not for your Jenkins continuous integration, but for something else. Okay, so there's a few of you there. I think this is a really cool thing. Immutable infrastructure has kind of been this philosophy that I think even before containers, we saw people were starting to really adopt, and as a mindset of going, let's make my servers read-only. So if something, and put all of their data storage somewhere else, and if something goes wrong with it, I rebuild it because I've got the automation in place to do it. And I think in many ways, all of the container systems that are going on with Docker, with Rocket, everything CoreOS is doing, Kubernetes, we're going to see this shift to more and more small immutable infrastructure. And we get asked a lot, what does this mean for config management? Because the people are in this mindset of going, well, what Puppet's really good for is running on a server and making sure as configurations drift, it just remediates it all the time. But I think the thing we all learnt, if any of you went through sort of the 90s, where images, like big monolithic images, were how you deployed everything, it just moves where configuration management is useful. It's not necessarily at runtime, but it's at build time. You still want something that really accurately models and describes your infrastructure, and then it just spits out an image at the other end. So we saw this a lot with the people who still do image deployments but have adopted Puppet. It suddenly becomes an artifact that they spit out and create. And I think we're seeing much the same thing with containers. It's a really cool thing, immutable infrastructure, and I think as we saw from, there's a lot more of you investigating it than are running it in production. We're going to see more and more of that. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how configuration management changes once it becomes more focused on build time as well as runtime. That being said, I'm a little bit of a container skeptic, and I really don't think all workloads are going to move to containers. We're always going to have a place for both places. How many of you filled out the DevOps report that we did? How many of you had no idea we did it? That's okay. So for those of you who aren't managers, or for those of you who are managers, this is a really good report to kind of read and get an understanding of what's going on in this space with DevOps, with the changes in culture and tools that are going on, and how companies are adopting automation and actually getting real sort of business value out of it. For those of you who aren't managers, there's a really good link to send your manager if you're having trouble convincing them that you need to deploy some kind of an automation system. It was really cool. We saw actual data saying people who've adopted configuration management and automation and these DevOps practices perform better, they release applications faster, and perhaps most importantly for a lot of business people, they actually outperformed their competitors in the market. So there's a lot of really useful, interesting information in that one. So this is kind of what we do. We think this is our job, is to kind of be here as an enabler and build these tools that let businesses respond to change really quickly, create change, push it out, and then change it. Because everything is changing. I think that idea that we had of static infrastructure where you did a big heavy design document, you went, this is the deployment, we're going to do software updates once every 6 months. You just can't do that. I mean, just the SSL vulnerabilities alone in the last year have, and that's a trend I'm not sure I'm so fond of, the whole branding of, cute little names. I don't think there's anything wrong with CVE identifiers. So this is what Puppet does. So a lot of you have been using Puppet for a while, so I'm kind of going to skim over this, but I think it's worth sort of stepping back and looking at a high level. What is it we're actually trying to do? We automate configurations, and we let you push them out really easily. We let you test them, and then we let you push them out. Then we push them out to production. This is really what Puppet's kind of about. We kind of see it as a change platform, a way to define change, communicate about it with the rest of your company, and then deploy it to production. We automate a whole bunch of things. I came from a world of using tools like Radmind and various sort of file-based configuration management systems where you sort of had to put your own semantics on top of them, and you'd continuously go, okay, well, this service is composed of these 20 files configured in this way. And I think it's one of the huge changes for Puppet for me was actually being able to describe the intent of what it is that you're doing. What I want to do is create a user. I don't want to, faff around with etc shadow password and file system home directories and entries around the place. I want to create a user. And I think this is the cool thing about Puppet. We have these higher and higher abstractions that you get to go through that actually match the intent that you have. And I think particularly it replaces documentation a lot of the time. Of what is it you want to do? Well, have a look at this Puppet code. I'm adding a user, and I want these to be the attributes. But you can see that we've gotten sort of higher and higher up the stack. I think when I first started using Puppet, almost everything was a user, a group, a file, a service, a package. But now we've got really, really cool abstractions, and I'll sort of cover some of them, and they go up as high as whole cloud instances or whole containers. We define the state that we're in. Those of you who are new to Puppet, you'll hear this word declarative a bunch of times, and really it means that you're declaring the state something is in, or that you want it to be in. Rather than describing how to get there, you just describe the state you want. And this is what lets Puppet run over and over again and just go, well, the intent is for this desired state, and this is the current state, and I've just got to work out how to get there. And that's sort of what all of the abstractions we build do. They work out the path for you. Then we test it. How many of you don't use no-op mode? I'm always kind of interested. Yeah, who's not using no-op mode at all? Okay. I think this is one of the big advantages of Puppet, because we've got this really tightly modeled system with the catalog that we ship to agents. The agents can sit there and go, here's what I want, here's where I am, and I can show you what the state changes would actually be. And then we enforce the whole system, we actually push out the change, and then we have reporting that will show you that. And I think this is another thing I really love about Puppet, that we have these really strong semantics around report objects. You're no longer reduced to sort of reading lots and lots of log lines to work out what happened. You actually get a report, and you can look at that object. You can build your own systems. You can use Puppet Enterprise, but there's a report object, and it's structured data, and you can go, this is actually what changed. I can ask it questions. I can do maths on it. I can go, 7 resources changed today and 12 changed yesterday. What does this actually mean? So let's go through how it works pretty quickly. Hopefully most of you have seen this before. We've been using Puppet. If not, Puppet's really good at managing SSH, as you should have learned from many, many demos and descriptions. But it's simple. I've been in previous jobs where I managed to teach my auditors to read Puppet code, and no longer sort of communicating through lots of documents going, well, this is the change system, and this is the change we actually made. Even people who don't know Puppet but have some idea of reading text and code can look at a chunk of Puppet code and go, oh, okay, this is what's going on. I'm ensuring this file exists. I'm ensuring it has these attributes, and that's what's actually going to change. We get to create relationships between these things. And again, that's another. Who's using manifest ordering instead of explicit relationships? So the rest of you are doing require, like explicit relationships. If you didn't realize, like we turned on we added a feature in the last year or so called manifest ordering, where you get to say, if you want, you can have these resources in the order they're written is going to end up being how they're applied in order. And you can still create relationships, and I'm still a big fan of actually explicitly defining those so that you can look at the Puppet code and actually work out explicitly how something's going to go. But if you're just doing a bunch of really simple scripts with Puppet, it's really nice to be able to just do ordering. Who's running Windows as well as Linux, Unix? Really? You don't have to be ashamed. It's not the 90s anymore. Microsoft are not as evil as they used to be. No. We actually really like a lot of the stuff Microsoft's doing these days. But seriously, who's running Windows? Interesting. No, 'cause some people have to. Some people, are on a .NET platform. They're on something else. That's really interesting. One of the things I hated running Windows when I had to, click through lots of GUIs, but I haven't been a Windows admin since NT4, primary domain controllers, so it's been an awfully long time. If you do have to run Windows boxes, like Puppet's a really great way to automate them. If you have a look at this, it looks pretty much the same. Once you get over the slashes being around the wrong way and these strange drive letters and colons, it's not that different. You can manage, whole websites in IIS with Puppet. You can manage registry entries. I used to do a lot of desktop management in the past where I had to deal with Windows. And you end up having to push out small registry entries all the time. And Puppet's really, really awesome at this. Who's uploaded a module to the Forge? Okay. We love people sharing content on the Forge. I think, really early on, this became one of the early core tenets of DevOps was sharing. And this is the other cool thing about Puppet. We can bundle these abstractions together. We can go, I want to manage Postgres. And someone already on the Forge has put together a really good Postgres module because it turned out they cared about it even more than you did. And then you can just use that. And if it doesn't do something you want, you can issue a pull request against it and keep contributing to Puppet code, just like any sort of other software project that's in open source. So however you're using Puppet, whether you're getting modules from the Forge, whether you're writing everything yourself, this is how it works. And it's kind of good to have a quick refresher. The node collects facts about itself, what its IP address is, what kind of OS it is, kernel version, all these different things, sends them to the Puppet master. The Puppet master takes the manifests, that Puppet code that we showed before, combines them with the facts, and produces a catalog. And the catalog is like a pure state description. And I think ever since PuppetDB, and we actually had something that actually performed really well that stored all of these catalogs, for those of you who use the old Active Record Rails system, we can now do stuff. We can ask questions about the catalogs that are stored inside the system. And the catalog, I think, is really great because it's not shipping code down to the agent. It's really safe to just go, here is a pure state description that I know is going to produce the outcome that I actually really want. Who's running PuppetDB? Who didn't know about PuppetDB? Okay. So I'd love to chat to people about why you're not using PuppetDB. We see this as a really core part of the platform. PuppetDB essentially is there to collect all of the information Puppet has to work out as it does what it does and store it somewhere so you can ask it questions. Some of you might have been scared off by the fact that it runs on the JVM, but we're not writing a lot of Java code. PuppetDB is entirely in Clojure, and we find it just performs really, really well. Particularly lots of concurrency and high data throughput. We're just having real trouble getting Ruby to sort of hit the sort of levels we want. Some people will have lots and lots of Puppet masters all submitting code to PuppetDB and asking it questions. We're in fact seeing a lot of people move away when they're using things like iSinger from the old exported resources model. We're seeing people move towards their monitoring in Puppet, instead just asking PuppetDB questions. And I'm actually a really big fan of that approach. That's how we've moved internally. Who's running the new Puppet server, the one that runs on the JVM? Who's scared of it because it's Java? It's not Java. I have good news. It's not Java at all. Sysadmins hate Java, and I actually think the reason sysadmins hate Java is Java developers rather than Java itself. Here, have a WAR file, make it work. We moved to the JVM for a bunch of different reasons. We realized that the Puppet code was starting to sort of creak around the edges a bit as far as Ruby went, particularly as far as performance. But we didn't want to rewrite the whole thing. Rewriting a successful working product is kind of a waste of time. You end up in this silly phase where you're like, well, I'm not adding features to the old one while I'm rewriting the new one, and the new one doesn't quite do what the old one does. So we moved to the JVM because it lets us take all of the Ruby code for Puppet and we run it under JRuby, which in a lot of ways actually outperforms MRI Ruby in a whole bunch of cases. But it meant that we could take the performance hotspots, the little bits where Ruby wasn't doing such a good job, and replace them with Clojure. And Clojure we're really big fans of, and we've gotten really good performance about it. If you are still sort of on the fence about Puppet Server, I suggest hunting down Chris Price's talk that he gave at PuppetConf last year, that should be on the YouTube channel for Puppet Labs, and you'll see in a whole bunch of cases, performance is radically, radically better. Once we started deploying the Puppet server internally, we just couldn't imagine going back. We were getting all sorts of concurrency that was just way more predictable. One of the things I did find pretty frustrating about Puppet in the past was with the server, once it got overloaded, it sort of behaved unpredictably. I don't know how many of you have had the thundering herd problem where too many clients check in at once and you're trying to work out how does the server actually recover from that. The Puppet server on the JVM is way more reliable and predictable under load. You know, things will slow down when you've got more resources than you can actually, when you're asking to do more than you can actually do, but it will keep doing them in a pretty predictable way. Is anyone using Razor here for provisioning? Okay. If you haven't looked at Razor in a while, Razor is a pretty simple sort of provisioning system that lets you create rules to go, if it matches these attributes, I want it to have this kind of a image on it. And the thing I like about Razor is there's often a schism between provisioning and config management, and you can take all of that data that's generated and defined at provisioning time and push it up to the Puppet config management system. Who's running mcollective? Who has run mcollective and isn't anymore? Okay. mcollective is really cool. It gives you parallel, you can ask questions of your network. You can go, I want to ask all of the CentOS 6 boxes, you know, what version of SSL are you running? And we find this is really, really useful for a bunch of sort of security incidents. We sort of have this pretty standard path now where we go, let's push out the change using Puppet. Let's create some queries in PuppetDB to check that the config actually ended up there. But then let's ask with mcollective, are you actually running that version? Or even try and build a simple little RPC test case to say, is this vulnerability really there? Because a lot of the new vulnerabilities, people are producing little test cases so you can actually test, even though I've installed the package, did it actually work? Am I still vulnerable to that instance? Who's using Hira? That's awesome. So Hira, has been a really huge change. We know there's a bunch of things we still want to do. We want to make it much easier to debug Hira lookups. We want to make it much easier to manage complex hierarchies of data. But I think this is really transformative, being able to separate the data from the model. It stopped a lot of the editing of Puppet manifests. I think it made modules a lot more reusable. It made it a lot easier to share content with each other. And it also meant that when you're modifying code or model, when you're modifying the data or the model, and you're like doing peer review, code review internally, you know what kind of a change it is. It's a really different change to go, I'm changing the model for Nginx versus I'm changing the data that goes into the model. And you get to review that quickly, and I think it means that change happens much more quickly. Who's using R10K? So if you haven't looked at R10K, I highly suggest having a look at it. It solves a whole bunch of really, really big problems, I think, when you're running sort of Puppet infrastructure. It lets you essentially map Git repositories, forge modules, and compose all of these things and go, that's what this environment is in Puppet. And I think particularly coupled with directory environments that we introduced in a few recent versions, it makes it much, much simpler to go, I want to create a new branch in Git that just becomes a new environment in Puppet, so I can test out a bunch of changes in a lightweight cycle and then promote to production. R10K is like the foundation of some of the stuff you'll see in Puppet Enterprise, but it's another open source project. The thing I also am really proud of with R10K is one of the sysadmins at Puppet Labs, Adrian Thibault, Finch on IRC, if any of you hang out there. He wrote it to solve a problem we were having at Puppet Labs running Puppet. And then it kept going for a couple of years, and it's really quite mature now. We've got lots of really good contributions. The rest of the engineering team contribute to it. And I just really like the fact that it was a sysadmin's problem that led to R10K getting built. Who's on Puppet 4? I know it's pretty new, and you've probably all been at a conference for the last week. So last week, Puppet 4 came out. Puppet 4, I think, is the biggest change in Puppet we've seen, at least maybe since we changed variable scoping in Puppet. We've added a whole bunch of new language things. We actually rewrote the parser from the ground up. So who's using the future parser with Puppet 3? Okay, so if you didn't know, in Puppet 3 we enabled the ability to turn on the future parser, which is the parser for the language that you get in Puppet 4. And you're going to see us doing this more and more. We've actually now made it so you can turn on the parser per environment if you're on 3.8. And this is a path we're going to take more and more. We're going to try and have not these huge changes that people have to deal with all at once, but give you a way of sort of taking little bits of the future and trying them out and evaluating them without sort of reinstalling your whole Puppet system or setting up a whole test environment. So for the last year or so, we've been testing the future parser. There are so many really, really great things about it. One thing that I want to try and make everyone aware of is we're moving to an all-in-one agent for open source Puppet for version 4. So rather than satisfying all of the dependencies with the package management systems, we're actually moving to an all-in-one agent. There's a bunch of different reasons for this, but the prime one was that we needed to be able to sort of create more robust infrastructure. We were finding it really difficult to keep up with all of the different packaging versions and the sort of differences between the dependencies we have in Puppet. And we're finding a lot of admins were just finding, particularly for the agent, really difficult to get the right match of different bits of config to get going for there. We have open sourced all of the packaging for this. So for those of you, and I know there's a lot of people who really love the packaging systems in their distros and want to try and make sure Puppet is just a small component, we can still do that. We're trying to make sure that we can support both cases, but the default install is an all-in-one agent. And one of the big reasons we're doing this is we're trying to make sure that we don't want Puppet Enterprise and Puppet users to feel like they're running completely different bits of software. So we're unifying the agent is the direction we're generally going in, so that there isn't as much friction to move back and forth between each. You know, we want people to use Puppet Enterprise who want to use Puppet Enterprise, but we don't want people to feel locked into it. We want people to be able to move away from it if it's not useful and move to it if it's useful. We really don't want to be one of those software vendors who's like, well, now you've installed our software, you're trapped with us forever. Particularly, we didn't want the Puppet code around managing Puppet and the tools people are writing to fork. We didn't want to feel like there was a schism in the community. We have a big community with people ranging from all different ways they're using Puppet, and we really didn't want to end up in this place where the file system paths were radically different from Puppet Enterprise to Puppet Open Source. And so a lot of this unification is about trying to bring those two things together. The big things that you probably care about the most, though, are the language enhancements that we've done. We rewrote the parser. We've made it a lot more consistent. I think one of the things you get with an open source project that's had lots of contributors over the years is it's not necessarily as consistent as I would like. Those of you who've tried to do really complicated things in the Puppet language have probably noticed that there were sort of edge cases where it wasn't clear what was going on, not least of which everything was a string in Puppet, which sort of got a little bit frustrating. So we've done a bunch of things here. We have an optional type system. And you don't have to use this. You can still write Puppet code that looks exactly the same as the stuff you're doing now. But you can declare what kind of an object something is. And this can be really useful, not least of which is that you can start writing tooling and doing things where you can actually lint code and go, well, you know, it expects an array, but you're trying to do string methods on it. And so you'd end up in those sort of odd circumstances inside the DSL where you're calling out to a million functions inside Puppet Lab's standard lib to split strings and join strings and turn things into arrays and create booleans. Again, this is optional. But I think this is something that's really going to allow people to write much more rigorous Puppet code. You can iterate inside the DSL. You don't need to call out to a function. You don't need to go and spend ages going through all of these different, subsequent variables, calling out to the Puppet standard lib, and then trying to do iteration. We can do it directly in the DSL. And I think this makes Hira even more powerful, because you can start defining all sorts of attributes of resource kinds, including the kind of resource it is, and then pulling it into the DSL really, really easily, iterating over it and creating resources. This is where we're going in general. If you have a look at Puppet Enterprise, those of you who are running it, or those of you who've been looking at it, we're moving it to much more of a layer on top of the open source platform. Again, we didn't want to create that schism. In some ways too, it was a whole bunch of work for us to create different packaging systems around the two. So we're trying to make sure that Puppet Enterprise is a much stronger layer, adding different kinds of functionality. You're going to see a lot of our open source work is going to be innovations around the agent, around the language, around all these sorts of things. But we're moving to a lot of the server innovation, apart from Puppet Server itself, will be these higher level bits of functionality. like the node manager, lets you do rules-based classification for nodes. So you can say if it matches these attributes, it's going to get these workloads. You can see we've got a whole bunch of provisioning stuff there that I'm going to cover pretty quickly. If you're using Docker, this is a really great way to start running containers. You can define them directly in the DSL. So this is the tide of abstraction that I was talking about. We're not just users, we're not just groups. Did you have a question? I beg your pardon? I don't know what's going on with the AIX client, to be honest. Yeah, AIX is really, really, really expensive to develop on because you have to buy all this AIX stuff. And it turns out they don't make that very easy. But yeah, I can chase up and find out for you. I think we've contributed a lot of the patches back to core to make sure that it'll run on AIX, but that whole build tool chain is kind of complicated. We can do whole AWS instances. If you are using the cloud, it's not just the instances you can manage. We can manage the firewall rules, the load balancers. We can go through and do all of the auto-scaling groups. You can start defining these things in Puppet. And I think you're going to see, even as on-premise infrastructure as a service gets more and more sophisticated, we can build these abstractions with Puppet that let you manage them in the DSL, just like you manage a local user. One of the things I really liked about Gareth's work here on the AWS module is he's gone and written a whole bunch of testing. So you can sit there and sort of do actual sort of validation on all of your code and make sure that it's going to work. Code Manager is what we're building on top of R10K. So R10K is staying as an open source project. We're building sort of higher level tooling around that for sort of change management workflows, particularly for people, those of you who are in larger organizations, who sort of have to have different groups interacting with each other. This is much more built for that sort of business need. Role-based access control. I imagine more of you are probably running OpenLDAP than Active Directory, given the few Windows hands that's current up before. That's the one place we do tend to see Windows. But you can just integrate directly with OpenLDAP and create all of those roles and filters that match object types in OpenLDAP and map them to permissions in the directory. And if you're on the enterprise version of Server, we have a bunch of Graphite and JMX interfaces that let you see a whole bunch of the internal metrics of the Puppet server itself. We found this one really useful internally, just being able to check Puppet server performance under load and being able to just sort of have this really easy access to information. And then we get all of the event inspection. You can take all of the stuff, if you're using a whole bunch of different consoles here, the enterprise one shows you all of those events. I'm going to start accelerating through because I actually want to give you guys some time for more questions. If you're an enterprise, these modules, which are all open source modules on the Forge, you actually get support for, just like you're running Puppet Enterprise itself, and you get support if you're a commercial customer. If you're paying us for the enterprise subscription, you actually get support around all of this content as well as for the core product itself. And one of the things I've gotten a lot of questions about is you released Puppet 4, but it's not in the enterprise version yet. Does this mean that you don't think it's ready for production? And that's really not what we're doing. We think Puppet 4 is totally ready for production, but the upgrade path is kind of complicated. And there's lots of different ways that people can do and install Puppet. But on enterprise, we have a much smaller sort of range of options. We know people are on a standardized platform. So we're building much more upgrade tooling for those people. We're going to keep documenting and showing people how to do a lot of the upgrades. But on the enterprise people side, we're looking for much more sort of assisted upgrades, which is honestly something that's really difficult because we want to keep Puppet as a really flexible tool that can interoperate with lots and lots of different things. And if people have it deployed in different ways, it's much more difficult for us to provide automatic upgrade systems rather than tooling and explaining how to do it. I am skimming straight through because we're running out of time. If you haven't been to the learning site of Puppet for a long time, even if you've been using Puppet for a long time, puppetlabs.com/learn, there's a whole bunch of, you can download the learning VM, run through a whole bunch of little tutorials, you can see bits of pieces on our new information. We're moving to small little sort of video tutorials there that will introduce things like how to use the new parser, what the changes are in Puppet 4, and those sorts of things. If you hadn't come across the Forge before, this is where everyone sort of shares a lot of the content. People take their Git repos and then publish them to the Forge. These are where you can find pretty modules on an awful lot of things. We've seen really huge adoption with the Forge, and we're really, really happy with it. And if you want to come to chat to any of us about training and certification, we run a whole bunch of training all over Europe, all across America, and we really have always been big about training. Puppet Labs never wanted to be that sort of services company where if you bought software or used our software, you needed to get services consulting for 6 to 9 months before it was useful to you. And so we try and build this sort of training so that people can bootstrap themselves and become really self-sufficient. Documentation sites had an overhaul. I know some of it may have made your eyes bleed if you'd last looked at it 5 or 6 years ago. It's definitely much more discoverable these days, and it's much easier to navigate between different Puppet versions. Is anyone here a Puppet test pilot? Okay, excellent. We love the test pilots. If you are interested in sort of having more direct impact other than just code on the future of where Puppet, the platform, is actually sort of going, if you sign up for test pilots, we do these screencasts where our user experience team will create prototypes. So we did a lot of this with the future parser. We did a lot of test pilot work with people who signed up all around the world going, well, you know, here's the problem you have. I want to see if you can work through it using this new iteration function. And so we actually changed a lot of the language features, not just in response to the developers kind of giving feedback on the mailing list, but even less technical people who just wanted to get something done. And I think this is what lets us create much more usable software in the end. Ask.puppetlabs, if you didn't know about it, is like our Stack Exchange community forum for answering and asking questions. And we're still really big on the mailing lists, which have become ridiculously huge, and the IRC channel. But we find there's a whole bunch of people who really, really like having that sort of forum system. And one of the things I like about this is that I'm a big fan of email, but the trouble with email lists is knowledge sort of goes to die there. You ask a question and someone goes, oh yeah, here's this old message from the archives. And the cool thing about Ask.puppetlabs is the better questions get voted up, and it's much easier to actually discover them and sort of keep sharing knowledge with each other. We're hiring all sorts of people all over the world. You should all come to PuppetConf. Who's coming to PuppetConf this year? Come on, it's not that far. It's going to be awesome. So one of the things that's so exciting about PuppetConf this year is we moved to San Francisco. You know, it's where all the companies are with money. It's where lots of users are. It's easy to fly to. But we've become really big, you know, in the last few years. And PuppetConf is back in Portland. It's way cheaper. Our beer is way better. We have heaps of good food. People ride bicycles. You will all feel completely at home. It's glorious. I love living in Portland. It's really cheap too, by the way. Come to PuppetConf. PuppetConf is going to be absolutely amazing. I think if you're having trouble, you know, convincing your managers should go, we might even have some stuff up on the site going, you know, here's the way this email might go, that if you actually want to try and convince them. And if you have any questions, I think I have 10 minutes, is that right? Till 10:15? So, yeah, happy to have questions. And I have to remember, I'm going to repeat them so that everyone else can hear them. Yep. Absolutely. So the question is, you know, Factor returned everything as a string. And I think this is one of the really frustrating things about Puppet. You know, true is not necessarily true, and false is true, which can get pretty confusing. If you have an array, you don't have an array. You've got a comma-separated string. You didn't want an array. So there's a stringify facts setting that defaulted to off for the last few versions of Factor, I believe. A bunch of the more technical people here who've been using it more recently can answer, but basically Factor was defaulting to stringifying all the facts, but you could switch Factor to not turn all facts into strings. And the reason we defaulted to that in Puppet 3 is because the DSL couldn't cope. It still would turn things into a string. And so you'd end up with this workflow where you go, I've got a fact, it's not a string, it's not a string, and it's a string. And that was sort of confusing. So with 4, it flipped around. And if you're on the latest hire Puppet and Factor, you should definitely be in a world where that stuff isn't a string. If it's an array as a fact, in a structured fact, it should flow all the way through.
So I had the structured text and everything, but I was supported in the hierarchy config. So if I had a path
Okay. Okay. So the question actually ended up being not really about Hira consuming those things, but Hira's config for actual lookup orders using the structured facts. I can chase down the bug number. Nicholas might actually know the actual bug number. This is actually a really complicated problem. We've tried to implement this several times. It ends up being non-deterministic, which is bad. Like really bad. So we can go through the bug if you want, but I know the one you're talking about. We're trying to come up with a better way to express Hira config lookup orders, because that's sort of fundamentally the problem. If you have an array and you go and create that lookup order, the bug report, and I don't know if you found it, like has some pretty solid arguments for why this would be a terrible, terrible thing for us to implement. We've got patches sitting out there, people who tried it, and you were looking at me so skeptically. Like, he doesn't trust anything I'm saying. I swear, it's true. If it was easy, we would just do it. But the thing is, it actually ends up being non-deterministic, the way you look it up.
I did up to the Hira code, so it's here, same interface, REST, and we have to change many things to make it.
Yeah, so it was somewhat complicated to implement, but that sort of wasn't the problem. It didn't actually do reliably what people actually wanted, which I think is a worse problem. Code is code. Developers are cheap. And really easygoing. No. No. The question is whether we've got plans to get the Puppet Master running on AX. No. It's just way too complicated. I mean, it's possible maybe in the future, now that the Puppet server's on JVM and things, but honestly, without denigrating anyone who's running AIX, we're seeing people's AIX usage basically shrink and stay solid, and almost everyone who has AIX has Linux servers as well, and we're just seeing much faster sort of performance gains on the Linux server side. It's just like we don't have a Puppet Master on Windows right now. A lot of these platforms that we support as agents, we're not supporting as the master. So I don't promise we won't do it in the future, but it seems unlikely. Yeah, so the question was, are we doing anything around testing phases? So you're using service spec now. This has been something, I don't know, a lot of you have been following the community discussions. We've sort of been trying to work out what's happening a lot in that space with Puppet Lint and a lot of these sort of projects, like some of them sort of stalled a little bit for a while. We're definitely really invested in this. Beaker is sort of heading somewhat in that direction. Service spec is also there. I think it's something we're all working on. Like, we have to test our own Puppet code that we're running ourselves. But as far as the exact, whether we're going, this is the one solution for everyone, and we're not really supporting the others, that's not really where we are. We have a lot of service spec fans internally. We have a lot of Puppet R spec fans internally. We have a lot of Beaker fans. It's its own little open source community, even inside of Puppet Labs. But yeah, if you're like, that's the sort of thing we're talking and thinking a lot about if you look at the user lists and developer lists at the moment. So please keep taking part in those conversations. No. So we're not actually moving the agent towards Java. So that was the question. Is there an effort to do that? I mean, there's a few things you can do to mitigate JVM spin-up times, but that's not really the direction we're going with the agent. If you've looked at, is anyone running C-Factor? Did any of you know, who knew that C-Factor existed? Okay, so the general direction we're moving in is we're really committed to Ruby as an extension language and a way of writing parser functions and types and providers. But we actually ultimately want to be able to support more than just Ruby for those things. So we're looking at sort of formalizing those interfaces, just like we introduced external facts, and you can write a fact in Python, you can write an Objective-C, I mean, you could write it in Java if you wanted. So long as it returns JSON, it gets absorbed into the system. The general direction we're moving in with the agent is moving to a tight C++ core, because we really want to reduce the memory footprint. We want to make it much less resource heavy than it is. and we wanted to keep supporting the ecosystem around that with a whole bunch of different plugin languages. So server side, you're going to see us running on the JVM using a mixture of Clojure and Ruby for the foreseeable future. And on the agent side, we're generally moving to C++. I was pretty skeptical about this as well, but C++11 and C++14, they're not the C++ I grew up with and learned programming. We have a bunch of really good C++ programmers, and that tight core going really, really fast and not consuming many resources seems to matter a lot to a lot of people. Do we have concrete goals around performance between the two things? So first, we don't have the Puppet agent in C++ yet. We already saw C factor, like any of you who are using it. Some facts are like, even if you're running almost entirely Ruby facts, much, much, much faster, like order of magnitude performance. With the Puppet server, the big goal was compatibility at first. We really didn't want to produce a new Puppet server compared to the Puppet master that didn't behave the same way. So if you have a look at Chris's talk, you'll see some people are getting an order of magnitude performance improvements, but we've been focused much more on correctness and concurrency than actual sort of raw throughput. So I guess my answer is no, we don't have a goal, but we're already seeing sort of performance gains large enough that it's clearly sort of worth it. I mean, we did a bunch of experiments here. We didn't just decide, you know, let's roll a dice and work out what language we're actually going to move to. A big part of the reason too is we're getting more and more use of Puppet on network devices and with storage devices. And even though we can get, you know, Ruby onto a lot of these things because a lot of the network vendors are moving to Linux-based platforms or BSD-based platforms, we found that having a compiled binary on those platforms just makes it significantly easier for more people to use Puppet on more devices. I think I probably have time for one more question. I don't know. What happened to the caching of facts? It appeared and disappeared. Maybe it expired. I'm sorry, that was a terrible, terrible joke. No, I don't know. Yeah, and okay. I assume we probably found some horrible case where, you know, we were caching the wrong things. But no, I don't know that. But yeah, chase up with us and we can work that out afterwards. I might get one really quick one in, if anyone. No? Kara's cutting me off. Okay. Thank you very much. Looking forward to a good day.